Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jessica Christ. I am an education manager at the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Today's webinar is the second in a two-part series this spring called Science for a Sustainable Future. Science for a Sustainable Future is a joint initiative of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network and Springer Nature. This is our fifth year, and SDSN and Springer Nature bring together policymakers, government representatives, UN officials, and leading global scientists to discuss and advance the objectives of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. So today we are going to focus on the report, which is A World That Counts. So give me 1 second. I'm going to share my screen here. So A World That Counts, Mobilizing the Data Revolution for Sustainable Development is a landmark 2014 report prepared by the UN Secretary General's Independent Expert Advisory Group on the Data Revolution for Sustainable Development. This expert group was created in recognition that data is essential for monitoring progress and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The report emphasizes that data is not just a technical issue, but a moral one. To build a sustainable, inclusive world, we must count everyone and ensure that their lives and needs are reflected in the data that shapes policies and investments. This requires rethinking how to collect data in a way that is people-centered, inclusive, and transparent, while also protecting privacy and human rights and ensuring that marginalized populations are not excluded. As the report states, no one should be invisible. So today, to discuss how A World That Counts has impacted global education, I am pleased to welcome our moderator, Dr. Suzanne Grant-Lewis. Dr. Grant-Lewis is the Emeritus Chair of Education and Policy at education.org and has extensive experience working in the United Nations, philanthropy, and academia, including being the first female director of UNESCO's International Institute for Education Planning and the highest-ranking American at UNESCO at the time. So please, Dr. Grant-Lewis, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and a very warm welcome to everyone. I'm really delighted to be moderating this panel. It's got such a stellar group of panelists, all of whom in their professional lives have focused on education data. And so I'm pleased to introduce to you Dr. Marcos Del Prato, Research Associate at the Instituto de Investigación Educativa, Universidad Nacional de Chilecito in Argentina. Dr. Clara Fontavilla, who's with the British Academy Postdoctoral Fellowship. She's at the School of Education in the University of Glasgow. And finally, Manos Antoninos, Director of the Global Education Monitoring Report. We've organized today's webinar slightly differently. We've decided to go for a format that would support more dialogue, more cross-fertilization across our panelists. And we've come up with a set of questions. In reviewing the important report, A World That Counts, we've come up with a set of 4 questions to focus in on the pieces of the report that we think are particularly pertinent to education. The report was multi-sectoral in nature, and there are even few education examples in it, but nonetheless, it has been paid attention to in education, and particularly for data for the Sustainable Development Goals. So I will be asking a series of questions, and different configurations of our panelists will be responding. Our first question is going to zero right in on the subtitle, or the title of our webinar, and the subtitle for the report. Have we had a data revolution? If so, where is it failing? Where is it succeeding? And I'm going to ask Manos to start us off. Go ahead, Manos.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you so much for the kind invitation. And I'm also as happy to be on the panel with Clara and Marcos, who have really helped build this community together with the work over the last few years. The term data revolution is a catch-all phrase, which I think means all things to all people. So it's impossible in one answer to cover all of those aspirations that people might have had at the time. Let's also not forget that many of these people did not really have education in mind. I think primarily there were people from official statistics who wanted to expand the vision of how we move forward. But I would like to just, in this very brief introduction, reflect on two things that I personally had seen at the time in the Data Revolution report. The first is that recommendation related to principles and standards. And I think it's very important, and I would combine that with also the call for transparency and inclusivity of how data are produced. I was lucky enough to be at the time when the monitoring framework for the Agenda for Sustainable Development, for SDG 4, was developed. And it was developed essentially in a group with a group of people behind closed doors, people who were associated with agencies. And that's how things used to be done. That was not the right way. And I would be the first to admit it. And thankfully, with the arrival at the time of the new director of the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, the vision started to change. The immediate observation was, this is not acceptable. And the monitoring framework needs to support countries, and countries need to be leading it. So what was originally a technical group was gradually converted into a group of countries and organizations. It was called a Technical Advisory Group on SDG 4 indicators that helped develop this monitoring framework. And last year, we reached the key peak moment of this process, where the first Education Data and Statistics Conference was carried out by UNESCO in Paris. And that was really a pivotal moment because it institutionalized the process, and the group even converted into the Education Data and Statistics Commission, which only consists of 28 member states. And it is them now that are invited to take decisions on the future of the education monitoring agenda. So that's a very important principle that was respected. And I think it's important. It's probably not what many people first think when they think about a revolution. You don't do revolutions by committees. And yet it is really revolutionary in many ways in the way people are involved. The second, and I will stop here very briefly, there was a call and there was a demand to use multiple sources of information. And this call was essentially a bit of a holy grail for education statistics, because for a long time we have been relying on administrative data. However, so much more information was flowing in from different sources, survey sources, census sources. So this is a process where at the Global Education Monitoring Report, we supported the UIS to develop new methodologies to combine this information. And that generated two new important contributions: the development of estimation models for the out-of-school rate and the completion rate. And this is also very important. It has already started being used in the literature. It has already started being used to quote global statistics. And it's a process where we're trying to engage countries to understand more how that works and why that might be important. So I'll stop here. I think I already said enough. Two angles, two takes I have on the data revolution. You're mute. Sue, you're mute.
Clara, what are your thoughts? Have we had a data revolution in education?
Thanks very much. Well, I think that, of course, because the word revolution is so ambitious and so big, there is the temptation of simply saying, no, we have not seen a revolution, not the one we were expecting, because it has not happened for everyone and for all education levels, for all government levels, and so on. But I think that would be not a very fair assessment, because when the process started, the idea of having all this kind of data was felt and judged by many as an impossibility, a kind of chimera. And there were, in fact, two things that were routinely questioned or called into question, which was the desirability of having all these indicators and the feasibility of having them. And the question of the desirability, it's not a minor one. There was a lot of questioning and misgivings about what were the risks, the trade-offs of trying to monitor everything, and especially when it came to new areas like education quality, learning. This was questioned, and it took a lot of consensus building, a lot of dialogue, what Manos was commenting, including everyone in the table to, in a way, address this kind of legitimate misgivings. So when you think on where the debate used to be, which was, do we need to monitor everything? And now the question is, okay, how do we do it? Is the right way of collecting the data? I think that this is great progress, and it's a revolution in terms of mindset, perhaps. And in terms of feasibility, progress here has not been minor at all. We can, of course, be frustrated because still we don't have all the data that we think that we require in terms of the global or the thematic education framework. But still, when the SDG 4 and SDGs were approved, a few of them were still in the tier 3 and tier 2 of the Inter-Organizational Agency for Statistics, and it was difficult to upgrade them to make sure that none of them was dropped when this was possible. And again, it took a lot of political savviness, a lot of technical and political innovation, creativity, because essentially we're starting with nothing. For instance, for education, again, related to learning, at first it seemed impossible, both in terms of coverage and methodological development. There was not an agreement, there was not the data. And at this point, a few of them are already in tier 1, so they are perfectly accepted. They have acceptably good coverage. I think that if we have asked some people 10 years before, was this going to be possible, many would have, and myself would have been very skeptical. It seems very difficult. So I think that it's fair to say that, I don't know if we have seen a revolution, but in any case, revolutions are always unfinished business, and there is a reason many call for a permanent revolution, because the struggle needs to be to continue in many ways. So I think that we are at least on track towards this kind of change we want to see.
Certainly. And so you're noting the progress. I like the pointing out, is it desirable to be monitoring all this, and is it even feasible? And those were questions that were widely debated. Thank you very much. Let me probe a little more on this whole idea of data revolution, because the report talks about or argues for a data revolution that is a revolution for equality. So I'd like to turn to the issue of data availability. Has this been a big issue? In the report, it's quote, the report says, too many countries still have poor data. Data arrives too late, and too many issues are still barely covered by existing data. So how big an issue is data availability still? Is it for specific targets of SDG 4, specific indicators for those targets? And let me start with Marcos. Would you like to speak, please?
Yes. Let me share the slides. Can you see it okay or no?
Yeah, if you want to go into slideshow.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Yes.
So
very
what?
good. Thanks.
What I would like to discuss actually more my contribution more like a basic questions in the way I see it. Essentially, what is missing actually when the data is there? What is actually missing from the point of view of monitoring? It could be one related to report missings, or also due to the framework with the data is actually there. So when
Marco, can you make the slide smaller? We're still getting those gray boxes.
Okay, smaller, like that. It's better. Is that better or no? Hello?
They don't show up now. They're on the very side. Keep going. Thanks.
Okay. So I will speak anyway. So I consider two types of missing due to reporting. So when the data is actually there, but which is not reported in the UIS data, or missing due to the framework, when some key drivers of SDG 4 target are available from household surveys or learning assessment, but they're not present in the database of the UIS. From the point of view of, if you think about missing because of reporting, in a recent book we published last year, we worked through the different targets, and then we look at the different missing patterns due to reporting and to a framework. And we can see that there is a huge exclusion of combinations of drivers of inequality affecting more strongly learning indicators, where particularly two dimensions or two overlap or three overlap related to learning-driven disadvantage are not fully reported. And there is still possible to report or generate numerous overlap with the existing data. Our calculation, what we've done is essentially that around 390 combinations of 45% of data is not actually is reported, is missing due to not being reported. And we have compounded disadvantage only provided for five indicators out of the 14 SDG indicators. So that is more or less what I wanted to say about data. I will stop sharing now. About data availability. My main point is actually that data is there, but is not actually reported. Particularly in the case of learning indicators and overlaps. Overlaps coming from mainly three dimensions overlaps. That's
Great.
one concept missing due to reporting. Then is another concept which I will discuss later on, which is missing due to the framework, which is linked, from my perspective, to priority shift, right?
Right. And
sorry, I have
Marcos,
a lot of slides, but I couldn't. So yeah.
That's okay. I would encourage you to put the information about your book in the chat.
Yeah, it's all there. I
Everyone
can share
can
the slides
access
as well,
it.
actually, later on. So people
Because this is a
check
really interesting analysis, and it deserves people reading it in full. Thank you. Let me turn now to Manos to address this issue of data availability and what's being done.
Yes, I think Marcos gave a very good starting point. Let's remember that there have been two major reviews. They were called comprehensive reviews of the SDG monitoring framework for the SDG global indicators, of which, as you know, there are 12 in education. And the first covered in 2020 or 2019, 2020, the methodologies, but the one in 2024-25, which was just concluded in March, covered the issue of reporting coverage. And there was a very clear message from the UN that there should be no indicators allowed to continue being on the framework if less than 40 countries, both in population terms and in terms of number of countries, fail to report. So that caused some alarm in the education sector on a number of potential indicators. Early childhood development was one, literacy due to different proficiency levels. But the one that attracted most interest was the indicator 411, the kind of foundational fundamental indicator of learning outcomes in reading and mathematics, which is monitored at three levels: in early primary, at the end of primary, and at the end of lower secondary. Now, because of the presence of a couple of major international assessments, there is no particular problem in coverage for end of primary and end of lower secondary, where about 50% of countries and also in population terms report, which gives us an opportunity to monitor trends. But less than 20% of countries were providing data on learning in grades 2 and 3. Now, this indicator has been, of course, suffering a lot because there has been a long process. Many people were advocating for it because at the end of the day, it is at that level where we hope to be able to make progress to help children, especially in the poorest countries where they're struggling a lot with the language of instruction issues, poor facilities, poor quality teaching. And it's kind of a bellwether of an indicator that could perhaps attract people's attention to the challenges there. At the same time, many countries oppose it. High-income countries in particular, which, let's not forget, is about a third of the world, were opposing it, even though they routinely monitor learning at those levels. They felt it is perhaps intrusive and it's not the right way forward if we introduce a concept of measurement for children aged 8-9 years old. Anyway, the indicator has been approved, so there has been a responsibility, and people often are not very clear why they oppose or support. But it's also the case that the indicator was not being monitored. And there are two ways of looking at it. As Marco said, there are a lot of assessments, and a lot of money is going through the systems of countries to support assessments at that level. And yet, others might argue that very few of these assessments meet a minimum standard that is necessary in order to be able to communicate with some degree of accuracy really whether children are learning. So that caused quite a lot of debate, and a debate that is still ongoing. But I think it's important to remember, I think at this stage, we need to agree that an indicator needs to communicate something that everyone understands. So we do need a mechanism, what has been called a vetting mechanism, because a mechanism that introduces a certain set of criteria of what is equivalent to be monitored is really important. Otherwise, countries have no guidance as to where they stand and where they need to be. And that is also a particularly important signal for those who do give money for assessments, because often the assessment market, because it is a market after all, has been led by few organizations and few people who have a stake in seeing particular assessments, let's say, move forward. At the same time, forgetting that we do assessments not just for the sake of monitoring, but in order to support countries' capacities to build national assessment systems. And a vetting mechanism that sets clear criteria at the end of the day is intended to help countries develop their national assessment systems. And this is what we should all be aspiring for. The monitoring, the ability to monitor in a comparable way across countries is a secondary important by effect. But let's not forget the important thing we all have to work towards is country capacity, not only to produce, but also to know how to use in order to use the data in order to improve their education systems.
Thanks, Manos. Really important points. I think Clara would like to jump in here to add to the discussion.
Yeah, very quickly, because I think that it has been a very comprehensive overview of what happened. I would say on the question of datability, no one was ever naive on the fact that this was going to be a challenge. It was always discussed in the early meetings about how to operationalize and how to design a monitoring framework. It was a very sticking point because everyone was aware it was simply not possible to get this kind of data. Let's say that 10 years afterwards, I would say again that quite a lot of progress has been made in relation at least to certain indicators, but at the same time, as Manos and Marcos were commenting today, there are certain areas in which progress has been very difficult, starting, for instance, with the learning proficiency for grade 2-3 at this early grades, for instance, and other issues. I think that essentially what we are seeing here is that, at least in some cases, we are facing a bit of a wicked problem, in the sense that, as I understand it, part of the high hopes placed on the data revolution were grounded on the idea that global data demands would eventually translate in an increase in the domestic data supply. And this has proved true in some cases, but not all the time, essentially because I think that there has been a progressive realization, first of all, that assessment capacity or data-making capacity cannot be engineered overnight. And secondly, as Manuel was commenting, that sometimes the political interest is not necessarily there. So there are not the right incentives, or not everyone has the same motivation to produce all this data. So global data demands, I would say, that are not sufficient motivation or do not provide sufficient resources to create a statistical capacity in the education realm. And for instance, in the case of learning, I think it's one of the areas in which this is more exaggerated or visible, because there has been no shortage of initiatives oriented at creating this assessment capacity. And a lot of progress has been made on this regard. Again, we had almost nothing. Now we have methodologies, we have ways of harmonizing different data sources and so on. But still, despite this kind of efforts, not all countries are ready to provide the kind of data we need or they need for their own purposes. So I think that it is telling on the fact that these kind of assumptions have proven a bit problematic, and that we need to work more on what does a statistical capacity require. And essentially here, the development thinking is increasingly attentive to the fact that a statistical capacity cannot be disconnected from a state capacity in general. So if the administrative system is not there or is not ready, if there are competing priorities, it's difficult to simply create the data overnight, and it will simply not happen. It's difficult to create a robust image system in a country in which so many other peoples are lacking. So I think that, well, we are essentially entering this kind of a stage of the debate, but that would be my contribution. I think that we had a very comprehensive understanding at this point.
Yeah. Right. Thank you. Thank you, Clara. We're going to probe that a little bit more with this next question about trying to examine the link from the global to the local, and what influence is the global demand having on local. So both of you have spoken about capacity, and in fact, one of the recommendations, well, there's a whole set of 5 recommendations related to capacity and resources in the report. And number 1 is create a new funding stream so that there would be available of resources to do this capacity development, and involve private sector. And I love this line in the report that says, strengthening national capacities will be the essential test of any data revolution. So we can, put a little salt on the responses we had to our first question, where how do you define data revolution if the national capacities haven't really strengthened there? I'd like to hear from Clara and Manos a bit more about why isn't the demand there? Is it just seems too difficult? We don't have the Ministry of Education doesn't have the capacity to collect that kind of data, or they just don't care that that's not important to them? How do we understand this global demand, which is hugely, all the global actors, agencies, ODA actors, et cetera, are requesting the data, but it's not always being provided at the local area. So a bit more about the reasons for that lack of availability at the country level, and how much of that is capacity versus not what's important. Clara, and you want to start with that, and then we'll turn to Manos.
Yep. I will share just a quick summary of this. I think that, again, what we have seen here is that there is sometimes a bit of a mismatch between global data demands and local data needs. Again, I think that at some point, 10 years ago, there was a bit maybe the implicit expectation that there was a natural alignment, and that was useful for global reporting purposes, was also useful for domestic data needs. And this, to some extent, is true, but I think that also we have discovered that in certain areas, this is simply not true. The kind of data that states, vicinities, municipalities need requires a degree of granularity, of precision that perhaps global reporting does not allow for. So I think that we are seeing that sometimes there is more of a mismatch that we were originally assuming, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and again, this is not exclusive to the education sector. There is quite a lot of thinking in development circles on the notion that sometimes global data demands end up trumping the statistical priorities in countries and diverting resources from what I needed simply to report on these global monitoring frameworks. So again, this is not an issue exclusive at all to education, and I think that this is important to recognize. But still, I think that it's important to reflect on the trade-offs, on the risks of imposing this kind of global data demands. First of all, I mean, I think that there are 2 main risks. First is creating useless data, which is a problem per se, creating what some have called data graveyards, data that is there and no one wants to use, is a problem of good use of resources. But secondly, and I think this is more important, the thing is that collecting data for global monitoring purposes has a cost in terms of where the administrative efforts, the statistical efforts are focused, and this can become more problematic. Some have referred to something called the statistical trilemma, which is the tension, let's say, in satisfying harmonization, prescriptiveness, and local suitability or local actionability of global data. It's not easy to conjugate everything. And again, I think that the case of learning data is an extreme and very illustrative case of this kind of tension, because what we have seen, and Manos was touching upon this before, is that sometimes there is a risk of creating a tension between country ownership, creating the kind of data countries want and need, and inbuilt or perfect comparability, making sure that data is easily amendable to global comparisons. And in fact, the kind of data sources that can serve both purposes are not the same. Some assessments might not be very good for global comparative purposes, but they are very informative at the local level for education planning purposes. And I think that in the case of learning, this kind of tensions or the risk for this tension has become more apparent, and a lot of effort has been put there to avoid this kind of trade-off, to make sure that the global demands do not compete or distort local priorities. And here I think that the action from the UNESCO Institute for Statistics to make sure that different data sources can be used to report on global on the global framework and so on has been very important. A lot of technical and political effort has been put to these kind of purposes, but still the challenges are there. And I think that we need to recognize that at some point, we simply need to be making a decision. Sometimes some of the assessments we will be creating maybe will not serve the local monitoring purposes, but are important for global reporting, or the other way around. And maybe acknowledging that sometimes we cannot serve the two masters is a starting point. So that would be a bit my comment on this.
Thank you very much. And Manos, are we seeing that the global and regional comparative data is actually informing or stimulating policy dialogue practice at the country level? What do we know about this?
This is quite a difficult question to answer. I would say, first of all, that generally speaking, global data, or at least developing a global monitoring framework, does have a formative educational purpose. And I think at some point, casting our net a bit wider to capture a few issues is important for people's minds and thoughts as to what may matter. I could go into details. I mean, we have now some information, for example, from non-formal sources on the number of attacks on education. Of course, no country would accept that indicator, but from a global perspective, it's very important. Or that also can attract interest on some countries. But let me pass that and focus directly on the fact that at the end of the day, global and national needs may not need to be that different. In fact, they're very close. There are many more national needs, but a subset of national needs can be used for a global monitoring framework. And this is precisely what we have done as GEM report with the UIS. In 2015, the Education 2030 Framework for Action, which is the kind of roadmap for SDG 4, included a reference to the need for countries to set national benchmarks. And by that, we meant, and the way we interpreted it was the need to invite countries on a subset of the SDG 4 monitoring indicator set that all countries agreed, and we did that through the processes that I described in my first response, were important. So a set of 7 then became 8 indicators to set national targets for those, because our agendas are, of course, very ambitious. Every country is expected to achieve everything, and that is not very empowering, not very helpful for engagement. To their credit, 80% of countries have actually now taken part in this process and have set national targets for 2025 and 2030 for at least some of those indicators. And this is very important because essentially it links the global, in fact, often through the regional, because we have 3 regional organizations, the CARICOM, the European Union, and SARC, that have actually taken part in this, and also the Pacific community. And these are all indicators that most countries do monitor anyway. And because the participation was so high, we have also now developed a methodology that evaluates the country's probability to achieve its own national targets looking forward. And we believe that this is really important because essentially it tries to capture what is the contribution that every country is prepared to make for the global goal. We no longer say you have to achieve 100%, which is unfair, but we say, tell us what you are prepared to achieve. with your own means and from your own starting point. That's also very important because in the annual report that we have introduced to monitor these probabilities, which we call SDG 4 scorecard. In fact, next week will be the third edition of the scorecard. We basically identify countries at all levels of income from all regions that are making fast progress or are achieving their targets. And that's, of course, very important. And I think it's a message that we would like to convey also to the rest of the development community. Let's make sure that our new agenda, if we're lucky enough to have one, sets global aspirational goals, narrative goals, but then invites countries to set clearly what they are prepared to achieve, how far they are prepared to go.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. People should be looking out for the third SDG scorecard coming out next week. Thanks. Okay, I'd like to now go from looking at the global to the local, to reverse that and go from the local to the global. Are national data collection realities influencing the global monitoring? How should monitoring priorities shift? And Manos, I'm going to start with you first and then over to Marcos. Okay.
Let me start with, I think, what was also one of the intentions of the data revolution, a focus on equity. There is a focus on, there's a universality part of the agenda. So an agenda that is relevant for all, and that's something we have achieved, I think, with the governance mechanisms that we have. There is also an element of looking at the interactions between education and other development goals. That's also something we've made progress. And I could say a word on that at the end. For example, let me actually just say now, we have the issue of climate change. For a long time, the only indicator that monitors a commitment of countries to sustainable development in education was through self-reporting. In the last 2-3 years, we worked very hard to introduce a mechanism that actually reviews national curriculum frameworks and syllabi at 3 levels, grade 3, 6, and 9, up to 8 subjects in science and social science. And we have now been able to report for the first time on 110 countries. And you may think, and it's natural, the reaction that it's a very dry, shallow, narrow measure. And yet, it gives us very important policy insights. These are insights related to the fact that we have all committed to balanced curricula, but there's more coverage of these issues in secondary than in primary. There's more coverage in science than in social science. And climate change and biodiversity terms are very much underrepresented. So even such a narrow way of looking at things actually can really help drive policy. But the third item of the agenda was equity, the leaving no one behind, not having anyone invisible. Here, I think it's important to draw a lesson because we started with a lot of hope, and yet we realize that for global reporting, it is difficult. Countries should be monitoring many of these inequalities at the national level with their national indicators, but many of these measures are not really amenable to easy comparisons globally. But I would also like to say an interesting fact from our scorecard and our SDG 4 benchmark process. We tried very hard to identify one equity indicator. And that equity indicator was the most objective and easy, not one involving location on wealth or disability, which are very, very difficult concepts to measure, but disparities by sex. The disparity in the secondary education completion between boys and girls. You'd be surprised to know that this is the one indicator that the lowest number of countries, only 40%, have committed to set a target, even though hardly any country achieves parity. You have many countries that have large disparities at the expense of girls, and many, many more countries that have smaller but significant disparities at the expense of boys. Essentially, we have a target, we have an indicator, and countries are not prepared to set the target because they know they won't be able to achieve. And it's very difficult, despite all our aspirations, to invite countries to set targets that in which they admit they're going to fail. So I think that's an important lesson to remember. We have good global aspirations for certain concepts, and we need to continue inputting them. But in practice, countries are still finding it difficult. I think we're still doing baby steps in that. And at the end of the day, many of these measures may be more relevant at the national level with national measures of how countries understand. We may struggle much more to make this meaningful at the global level.
Yeah. Okay. Also on the equity, let me just probe what you've said, Manos. Earlier, you talked about using other sources than the government sources for measuring OSCE, out of school children and youth, and completion rates. Did the work on that, using taking advantage of existing surveys, et cetera, was that in part out of a demand from countries? Because in the work I've done on accelerated education programs for out-of-school children and youth, the evidence synthesis we did was very clear. Governments had no idea how many out-of-school kids they had. And they also had no idea how to serve them well. And so two thoughts came out of that for me that I wanted you to see if you could address, which was, is that that work, which is in GEM Views, the website that you should put a link to in the chat.
Yeah, I'm trying to make the link, but I cannot find the press button.
Okay. Is that partly out of demand at the country level? Go ahead.
So yeah, this is a good question. These models, estimation models that estimate out-of-school and completion rates are available, of course, on the VIEW website and on the UIS data browser. The UIS actually now makes available both information from administrative data, separately from survey data, and separately from the model estimates, which are now comprehensive. They cover basically every country. But we, of course, have agreed that these can only be used, I mean, the model estimates, for regional and global aggregates, and for countries that have not reported any data for the past 5 years. It is very difficult for countries to understand, make that transition. It requires a certain degree of data literacy. I think that's the main problem. Often ministries of education, staff in ministries of education do not have that data literacy. I have encountered time and again people who don't quite understand the concept of a survey. How is it possible to tell me the truth of what's happening if you go and visit 300 schools or 3,000 schools? I have 1 million schools or so. So there is a problem there of understanding. And there's also a very limited degree of communication between ministries of education and national statistical offices. That dialogue can be held with national statistical offices, but that dialogue unfortunately remains quite limited, partly because of the differences in capacity, the different languages essentially people speak. Having said that, it was very illuminating when we published the first data of the model and we drew attention to Nigeria, where for many years people were used to the concept of Nigeria having 10 million children out of school. Now we say it has 20, because of course after 2015 we stopped reporting only on primary school age children. The agenda is also for secondary school age adolescents and youth, and that came as a major shock. So there are important lessons also from there. Yes, countries should lead, but then countries also need some guidance of what is now the issue that needs to be monitored. And I don't think anyone would disagree that any country should be interested in the education pathways, not just of its primary school age children, but also its adolescents and youth.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Let me turn to Marcos. Again, the question is about local influencing global. Go ahead, Marcos.
Can you see my screen? Sorry, can you see my screen?
We can, yes.
Yeah, okay, good. So what I would like to say is, that point here is quite similar to the discussion from the global to the national and the nuances behind the source of inequalities. What I would like to stress, Manos can correct me now any latest improvement, but the SDG framework is a compromise between a universal reality and individuals' country problems and issues. Inequality is far too simplistic and is static, because the main drivers of inequality is essentially location, gender, and wealth. And we know that overlapping disadvantage will lead to wider marginalization. So we need to capture in more detail that sort of subgroups. That is a screen like a snapshot of how the different indicators of action, completion, and learning, and what sort of dimensions are reported. I mean, at least from 2023 and 2024. So we see there's not much information on 2 or 3 dimensions. So we need to, by neglecting the disaggregation of SDG 4 indicators, it will essentially lead to wider education deprivation if we don't account for this further compounded disadvantage. So we need a better targeting. We're using a slightly different framework, in my view, of monitoring SDG 4 target, which perhaps is aligned to what Manu has been discussing on that scorecards, right? The probability of different countries to achieve different things based on the target, right? So what I propose, we propose in a recent book, is essentially something quite simple. We have like a sort of layer sort of inequality, so they operate in different levels. It started at the student or the child, then moving on to the household, the school, and community, like a standard, if you like, sociological model, but with the life course approach. So that it would mean that the source of inequalities are not the same across the life course. They are dynamic. They will change. Say, for instance, in the case of secondary education, it will be about child work, whereas probably not in other levels and primary. So also we include new constraints at the household levels, crossovers, particularly with SDG 5, which, as we know, we got issues of social norms, early marriage. They're really important, no? Particularly for girls' education and the transmission of inequalities across the life course. So that is a little plot, a graph, of the different sort of new dimensions we suggested, which actually are there. They are in the learning service. That's the key point. We got information about indigeneity, preschool, whether a kid works, information about parental education input, parental education, and also at the school levels, we have information on the rate of teacher qualifications or ICT infrastructure. So we got an array of information which is actually no use. And that is what I mean about that not using it can lead to a wider, if you like, inequality of the group, no? Marginalization. So we find, I will leave that slide, we find if we work again through the different target, we propose different type of newly identified groups, you can see here, and essentially using a standard model, and we get that we cannot use that framework will essentially allow the better identification of those most marginalized groups. We come up with more than 100 newly identifiable groups and 14 and 18 dimensions. I mean, a typical example, a clear example is in the case of learning. It's not enough, as we know, no, to use only location, gender, and wealth, plus perhaps language spoken at home, right? To capture the nuance of how education inequality reproduce for learning indicators in a particular country. So we could add in the dimensions at the child or the student situation, like child work, disability, preschool attendance. Then we can move into the family, new indicators or new drivers of inequality. Parental education is key, parental education. And also schooling conditions, like infrastructure of physical or information computer technology, ICT, teacher qualification, or contextual factors, like which are really important, like what is the degree of poverty in a school, proxy by the socioeconomic status of the families, the average of that. What is the school rate of child work in that school? And that sort of framework, we believe that it will actually allow us to essentially not forget the most disadvantaged students, which they tend to suffer for all these sort of drivers of inequality. No? That's my contribution from the point of view what is missing. The missing is essentially, I know it's a difficult exercise, no, the SDG agenda, but it's essentially to make it more nuanced and to make it more rich in how inequality arises at the different levels of inequality, the educational life course.
Great. Okay, thank you very much,
That's what I
Marcos.
wanted to say.
That was terrific. And it's also, you're pointing out how if we are to have the data revolution become a revolution for equality.
Yeah, I mean, the data revolution is
thinking-
not revolution from the point the data is there. It's how you use the
Yeah.
data and what priorities
Yes.
you use the data for. And
Indeed,
I
indeed.
mean, and certain things I would say that, I mean, for instance, why you don't have a learning indicators, the division between private and public school. Why we don't have, I mean, because you get into the subsectors of the reality of the different countries. But that's a starting point, no? So in a way, in line to what Mano said, actually, that are also clear, no? That you need to, I mean, to actually answer and to move forward in equality, you need to start at the national level, right? With all the information you got and give it a cutoff point and compare the countries according to what can you do. And that's part of the exercise of the book, really, no?
Okay, thank you.
That's it.
Thank you very much. We have two questions that have been entered into the Q&A. Jessica, do we have anything more that you needed to pass along? We have these two, and certainly one is addressed to Manos, but Manos is happy to answer live. So let me just ask those two questions and see which of the panelists would like to respond. The first one is from an anonymous attendee and is saying there's an interesting tension here between the phrasing of the goals themselves and the ability to observe our progress toward any metric measuring the goals. As we approach 2030, how do you see the data reporting capacity affecting how we frame a new set of goals, if at all? Who would like to respond to that? I'll start with you, Manos.
Yes, I'm happy to take this question because it's also linked to the question some of the responses I already gave. I think that our reporting capacity generally globally has improved, not as fast as we would have liked, but generally we have more information. We don't have enough information on learning outcomes, enough to establish robust trends. But even here, I think we have some very fascinating findings over the last 10 years, because there's also a tendency to talk about a learning crisis and to bring poor countries in our minds. In fact, the data, that's what the power of the data is, tells us that this has been quite a constructed term. Yes, poor countries have very low learning outcomes, but these are criticized without a historical perspective of where these countries are coming from. And these countries, by all accounts, seem to be improving. By contrast, in the last 10 years, we have seen a dramatic decline in learning outcomes in the richest 50% of the world. Which is really terrifying in many ways if these indicators capture the reality. Especially in reading, a decline that has been going on for, as I said, more than 10 years, and COVID did not even accelerate it. So that raises, I think, a general question in response to what I was asked, which is, what are we really planning to have as goals and targets for a new agenda? Many will argue, of course, that promising universal secondary completion was premature. Not a single country in the world has achieved, to this day, universal secondary completion. So what purpose does it serve to set a language of that kind? What are we going to say about tertiary education? If we progressively expand the scope of these indicators? Should we set a very concrete target, and what would that be, and what would it mean? So I think the lesson of the scorecard process is that we need to set broad targets. We also, and we need to let countries determine how far they're prepared to go, given their means. But I think our targets should also embrace a language that is perhaps more qualitative and looks at issues of the content of education, and be a little bit more brave, because the power of these documents can be very important, and we really need to think very hard about where our education systems are going. And I think that this response also answers to the other question that was online. No country has achieved SDG 4, not a single country. Yes, there are, of course, big differences. Some countries are very well advanced, but there's always a way for countries to improve. And I think that is the purpose of these agendas. But we need to take note of the progress we're making and be a little bit more humble when we develop agendas.
Thank you. Clara or Marcos, would you like to say more on this question? Not at the moment. Okay. All right. So that we have another question, which is addressed to Manos, but others may have views on this. If we shift to ask countries what they're prepared to achieve and contribute, do we do a disservice in terms of providing external support financing to help these countries meet SDG 4? Do we let well-resourced countries off the hook for helping others if we reduce the expectation? Like, has it affect ODA, for example?
So that was the response I mentioned. A national SDG 4 benchmarking or target process does not let any country off the hook. Yes, of a range of 7, 8 indicators, not all indicators will be relevant. Some countries will have achieved 100%. But when it comes to, there are always some targets where countries can do better. And I think that's the key message. Every country has scope for improvement. Now, in terms of whether we let countries off the hook because we basically lower the bar and we don't ask them to achieve something unrealistic, I'm not sure that's how it works. And I think that's also part of the problem with aid. Aid, among many other problems it has had, has moved in recent years towards this concept of results-based outputs and financing. And I think that distorts the purpose of aid, especially in a sector like education. In education, we don't expect results to change dramatically from one year to another. But what can change and needs to change is better institutions. But the focus on results has shifted the attention of donors away from the institutional building and institutional capacity development. And I think that's a lesson for those who may still want to contribute money and help poorer countries, that their projects should focus on long-term capacity development of countries, establishing processes through which countries learn, and avoid this misconception that in 3 years, X number of children will have been reached, helped, etc. So I hope that gives an answer.
Yes, unrealistic expectations. Okay, I'm afraid we've run out of time. I want to thank everybody, thank the panelists for all their tremendous, sharing their tremendous expertise with us today. And thank you to the audience. Please note that there will be a recording available. You'll also see social media talking about this webinar and making some links to the site where you'll find the recording, and we'll have some a summary attached to that recording. So thank you everybody for being here today. We appreciate you being with us today to discuss this really important question. Thank you so much and goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks very much. Bye.